He thought his badge made him untouchable, until he brought the wrong woman to court. The Alabama sun was a relentless hammer, beating against the cracked dashboard of Kendra Ellis's rental car. Heat waves shimmered off the blacktop, distorting the already monotonous landscape. Inside, Kendra felt the subtle tremor of unease that always accompanied her consulting work for Naval Intelligence, a sixth sense honed by years in the service. The radio sputtered static interspersed with the fervent pronouncements of a local preacher. She silenced it, preferring the oppressive quiet. In the rearview mirror, she saw the woman she presented to the world, competent, professional, unreadable. Years in the Navy had sanded down any soft edges, leaving a carefully constructed mask of authority. But beneath the surface, fatigue lingered, a weariness born of too many battles fought, too many compromises made. The highway stretched before her, an endless green corridor, and she gripped the steering wheel tighter, willing herself to stay focused. Then headlights. Blinding, insistent, filling her mirror. Kendra's muscles tensed, her training kicking in. The vehicle was gaining rapidly, closing the distance with aggressive speed. Red and blue lights flashed to life, painting the twilight with an urgent, intrusive glow. Her gut clenched. Not again. With a sigh that tasted of dust and resignation, she signaled and steered the car onto the shoulder. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as she killed the engine, placing both hands on the steering wheel, visible, compliant. In the mirror, she watched the patrol car pull in behind her, a predatory presence in the gathering darkness. A large figure unfolded from the driver's seat, moving with a slow, deliberate swagger that spoke volumes about his sense of authority. As he approached, the harsh glare of the patrol car lights illuminated his name tag, Robert. A cold knot formed in Kendra's stomach. She'd encountered men like Robert before, men who saw the badge as a symbol of unchecked power, a license to intimidate and control. He stopped beside her window, his face a mask of impassivity. The beam of his flashlight pierced the gloom, momentarily blinding her. "License and registration," he barked, his voice flat, devoid of any warmth. Kendra met his gaze. Her expression was carefully neutral. "Of course, officer," she replied, her tone polite but firm. She reached into the glove compartment, retrieving the requested documents. She could feel his eyes on her, cold and calculating, and knew this was more than just a routine stop. This was a test. A challenge. The first move in a dangerous game. Robert's fingers were thick and calloused as he snatched the documents from her hand, brushing against her skin with a deliberate lack of courtesy. He held them up to the flashlight, scrutinizing them with exaggerated attention. "Everything all right, officer?" Kendra asked, her voice steady but carrying a subtle note of challenge. He ignored her question, his eyes still glued to the papers. The silence stretched thick with unspoken tension. The Alabama heat seemed to intensify, pressing down on her like a physical weight. "Where are you headed?" Robert finally asked, his eyes still fixed on her license. "Just passing through," Kendra replied, keeping her answer deliberately vague. It was none of his business where she was going or why. "Passing through, huh? Where are you coming from?" The question was laced with suspicion, an insinuation that she had something to hide. "That's not relevant, officer," she retorted, her voice hardening. "I've provided my license and registration. Is there a problem?" Robert smirked, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face, revealing a flash of yellow teeth. "Oh, there's a problem, all right. Your taillight is out." Kendra frowned, a flicker of annoyance crossing her features. "That can't be right. It was working perfectly just this morning." She checked them herself before leaving the hotel, a habit ingrained from years of service. He chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver of unease down her spine. "Well, it's not working now. Step out of the car, ma'am." "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice incredulous, a hint of defiance creeping in. "Step out of the car. I need to take a closer look." His tone left no room for argument. "I'm not stepping out of the car unless you have a valid reason," Kendra countered, her resolve hardening. She knew her rights, and she wasn't about to be bullied. "I have a valid reason." I told you your tail light is out. Now step out of the car. I'm not convinced, she replied, her eyes blazing with defiance. Show me the tail light. Robert's face flushed with anger, a vein throbbing in his temple. Are you refusing to comply with a lawful order? I'm asserting my rights, Kendra shot back, her voice ringing with conviction. I have committed no crime. I'm not a threat. There's no reason for me to step out of this car. Robert reached for his radio, his movements jerky and agitated. Dispatch, I have a non-compliant driver. Requesting backup. The air inside the car seemed to grow thick and suffocating. Kendra's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to show fear. She knew this was a game of intimidation, and she wasn't about to back down. As Robert waited for backup, a second patrol car arrived, its headlights cutting through the darkness. 2 more officers emerged, their expressions grim, their presence radiating a palpable sense of menace. Kendra knew she was outnumbered, outgunned, trapped. But she refused to be broken. She would not give him the satisfaction. With a sigh, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out into the oppressive heat. Fine, she said, her voice tight with suppressed anger. I'm stepping out. But I want you to know that this is an abuse of authority, and I will not forget it. Robert smirked, a triumphant glint in his eyes. We'll see about that, ma'am. As Kendra stood beside her car, Robert barked out orders, his voice laced with contempt. He ordered her to place her hands on the hood, to spread her legs, to submit to a humiliating search. She hesitated, her pride warring with her sense of self-preservation. Then, with a deep breath, she complied, her body tense with controlled rage. The metal was hot against her palms. As Robert approached her from behind, his presence loomed over her, invading her personal space. As he began to pat her down, Kendra noticed one of the other officers, a younger man with nervous eyes, staring at her with a look of conflicted emotions. His name tag read Ethan. He seemed uncomfortable with the situation, his conscience at odds with his duty. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, avoiding eye contact. It was a flicker of humanity in the face of overwhelming oppression, and it gave Kendra a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't entirely alone. The next morning, Kendra woke with a dull ache behind her eyes and a burning sense of injustice simmering in her gut. The humiliation of the traffic stop replayed in her mind, each detail etched in sharp relief. Filing a complaint felt like a futile gesture, a David versus Goliath battle she was destined to lose. But the alternative, allowing Robert to get away with his abuse of power, was simply unthinkable. After a restless night, she began to build her case, meticulously documenting every detail of the incident. She photographed the taillight, which stubbornly refused to malfunction. She transcribed her memory of the encounter, capturing not just the words exchanged but the nuances of Robert's demeanor, the subtle threats that hung unspoken in the air. It was a painstaking process, allowing chipping away at the wall of impunity that protected men like Robert. Later that day, Kendra walked into the local police station, her head held high, her shoulders squared. The air inside was thick with suspicion, the silence punctuated by the clatter of keyboards and the murmur of hushed conversations. She approached the desk sergeant, a burly man with a weary expression, and presented her complaint. He barely glanced at it, his eyes conveying a message of weary indifference. "Fill this out," he said, shoving a form across the counter. "But don't expect much. These things usually go nowhere." As Kendra began to fill out the form, she felt a presence beside her. It was Ethan, the young officer from the traffic stop, his face pale and drawn. He hovered awkwardly as if torn between conflicting impulses. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I saw what happened out there," he said, avoiding eye contact. "It wasn't right." Kendra looked up, a flicker of hope igniting within her. "Are you willing to testify?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Ethan hesitated, his eyes darting nervously around the room. I don't know," he stammered. "It's complicated." She finished the form and handed it back to the desk sergeant, who took it with a perfunctory nod. "We'll look into it," he said, his tone conveying the unmistakable message that he had no intention of doing so. Kendra left the station, her hope dwindling but her determination unshaken. She knew she couldn't rely on the police department to investigate itself. She would have to find other allies, other avenues of recourse. Over the next few days, Kendra became a woman possessed, driven by a righteous anger that consumed her every waking thought. She contacted local news outlets, hoping to shine a light on Robert's behavior. She reached out to civil rights organizations, seeking legal assistance and guidance. She even attempted to contact the mayor's office, only to be met with a wall of bureaucratic indifference. As she fought for justice, Kendra discovered she wasn't alone. Other women had suffered at the hands of Robert, and they were eager to share their stories, their voices trembling with years of suppressed anger and fear. One of these women was Aaliyah, a vibrant, outspoken activist who had been pulled over by Robert several months earlier. Aaliyah claimed that Robert had subjected her to a degrading and humiliating search, making lewd comments and threatening her with false arrest. She had filed a complaint, but it had been dismissed without investigation. When Aaliyah heard about Kendra's case, she reached out to her, offering her support and her considerable organizational skills. Aaliyah was a force of nature, a whirlwind of energy and passion, and she quickly became Kendra's most valuable ally. Together, they began to dig deeper into Robert's past, uncovering a disturbing pattern of misconduct that stretched back years. They discovered that he had a history of targeting black drivers and using minor traffic violations as a pretext to harass, intimidate, and humiliate them. They found evidence of false arrests, planted evidence, and even instances of excessive force. The more they learned, the more determined they became to expose him, to bring him to justice, to put an end to his reign of terror. As Kendra and Aaliyah's investigation gained momentum, they began to attract unwanted attention. They received anonymous threatening phone calls, their email accounts were hacked, and they were subjected to a campaign of online harassment designed to intimidate and silence them. They knew that Robert was behind it, that he was desperately trying to protect his secrets. One evening, as Kendra and Aaliyah were meeting at a coffee shop, poring over documents and planning their next move, Ethan walked in, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. He approached their table, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to talk to you," he said. "I have something to tell you about Robert. Something that could blow this whole thing wide open." The courtroom was a pressure cooker of anticipation. Kendra, Aaliyah, and Ethan walked in together, a fragile coalition against a system stacked against them. The press buzzed, cameras flashed, and the air thrummed with nervous energy. Robert sat at the defendant's table, flanked by his lawyer, his face a carefully constructed mask of indifference that failed to conceal the tremor in his hands. The hearing began, and the prosecutor, a woman with a steely gaze and a reputation for integrity, laid out the case with methodical precision. She presented the body camera footage from the traffic stop, highlighting Robert's aggressive behavior and the clear violation of Kendra's rights. She called witnesses to the stand, each with their own story of harassment, intimidation, and abuse at the hands of Robert. Then, it was Kendra's turn. She took the stand, her voice clear and unwavering, and recounted her experience with Robert. She spoke of the humiliation she felt, the anger that consumed her, the determination to not be silenced. She met Robert's gaze across the courtroom, her eyes conveying a message of unwavering resolve. He looked away, a flicker of unease betraying his carefully constructed facade. Aaliyah followed her testimony with a fiery condemnation of the systemic racism that allowed officers like Robert to operate with impunity. She spoke of the fear and vulnerability that black women felt in the face of police brutality, of the need for accountability and reform. Her words resonated with the audience, many of whom had experienced similar injustices. Finally, it was Ethan's turn. He walked to the stand, his body trembling, his face etched with fear. He took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice barely audible at first, then growing stronger as he recounted the criminal conspiracy within the police department. He named names, described the crimes that had been committed, and provided damning evidence that implicated Robert and several other officers. As Ethan spoke, a wave of shock swept through the courtroom. The judge pounded his gavel, struggling to maintain order as reporters scribbled furiously, and the audience erupted in murmurs of disbelief. Robert's lawyer jumped to his feet, objecting strenuously, but the judge overruled him, allowing Ethan to continue his testimony. Then, the bombshell. Ethan revealed that Robert and his fellow conspirators were not only involved in protecting drug dealers and extorting local businesses, but also covering up instances of police brutality, including the death of an unarmed black teenager. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. As Ethan finished his testimony, a team of internal affairs investigators and federal agents stormed into the courtroom, placing Robert and several other officers under arrest. The courtroom descended into chaos. Robert lunged across the table at Ethan, screaming obscenities and vowing revenge. But he was quickly restrained by the agents and dragged out of the courtroom in handcuffs. The judge pounded his gavel, restoring order. He thanked Kendra Ellis and Ethan for their courage and their commitment to justice. He promised to ensure that Robert and his fellow conspirators were brought to justice, and that the police department would undergo a thorough overhaul. As the hearing adjourned, a cheer erupted from the audience, a collective expression of relief, gratitude, and hope. But Kendra knew that the fight was far from over. This was just the beginning. The aftermath of the hearing was a media circus. Kendra, Ellis, and Ethan became instant celebrities. Their stories splashed across every newspaper and television screen in the country. They were lauded as heroes, as symbols of courage and resistance. But the attention was a double-edged sword. They were also subjected to intense scrutiny, their every word and action dissected and analyzed. They received hate mail threatening phone calls, and were subjected to online harassment. The criminal investigation into Robert and his fellow conspirators gained momentum, uncovering a vast network of corruption that reached the highest levels of local government. Several high-ranking officials were forced to resign, and dozens of officers were suspended or terminated. The police department was in chaos, morale plummeting, and trust shattered. The community was deeply divided. Some hailed the arrests as a victory for justice, while others decried them as a witch hunt, claiming that the police were being unfairly targeted. The police union launched a campaign to discredit Kendra, Ellis, and Ethan, portraying them as dangerous radicals who were undermining law enforcement. Ethan, in particular, faced intense pressure. He was ostracized by his former colleagues and called a traitor and a snitch. He received death threats and was forced to relocate his family to another state. He struggled with guilt and remorse, haunted by the memory of his past actions. Ellis, too, faced challenges. She was targeted by right-wing media outlets, who distorted her words and painted her as a racist agitator. She received death threats and was subjected to online harassment. She struggled to maintain her privacy and protect her family. Kendra, despite her military training and her ability to maintain a stoic facade, found the constant pressure taking its toll. She struggled to sleep, haunted by nightmares of Robert and his henchmen. She felt isolated and alone, unable to confide in anyone about her fears. One evening, Kendra, Ellis, and Ethan met at a small, out-of-the-way cafe. They sat in silence for a long time, sipping their coffee, their faces etched with weariness. "It's hard, isn't it?" Ellis said finally, breaking the silence. "I never imagined it would be this hard." "It's a marathon, not a sprint," Kendra replied, her voice flat. "We knew this wouldn't be easy. I just want it to be over," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. "I want to put it all behind me. It will never be truly over," Kendra said, her eyes filled with weary wisdom. "But we can make it better. We can make a difference." Despite the obstacles, Kendra, Ellis, and Ethan remained committed to the fight for justice. They agreed to serve on the newly formed Civilian Oversight Committee, a body designed to provide community input into police policies and practices. They faced fierce opposition from the police union and bureaucratic inertia, but they persevered. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to implement reforms. They established new guidelines for police conduct, revised training programs to emphasize de-escalation and cultural sensitivity, and created a system for investigating citizen complaints. The process was slow and frustrating, but they refused to give up. The struggle was far from over. There were setbacks and disappointments, moments of doubt and despair. But Kendra, Aaliyah, and Ethan remained united in their commitment to creating a more just and equitable society. They knew that the fight for justice was a never-ending battle, but they were willing to keep fighting for themselves and future generations. Because, in the end, that's all that mattered. Making a difference. Leaving the world a little bit better than they found it.